Every year, thousands of people describe the same sequence. They wake unable to move. Something is standing over them, and whatever it wants, they do because they cannot do anything else. We have spent 60 years arguing about whether any of it is real. But there is a smaller question buried in the accounts, and almost nobody asks it. It is not about the ones who lay still. It is not the paralysis. It is not the examination. It is not the missing hours. It is what happened in the handful of cases where the paralysis broke. A person on the table, moving when they were not supposed to be able to move. They were not supposed to be able to. A few of them were. So what does something with total control do the moment it stops having it? I want to start with a number. Not a dramatic number, a quiet one. David Jacobs is a historian. He taught at Temple University for decades, and he says that since 1986, he has sat through more than 1,200 hypnotic regression sessions with people who believe they were taken. 1,200. That is the number I keep coming back to, and not for the reason you would expect. Because it does not count what happened to anyone. It counts how many times a story was recovered under hypnosis. Those are not the same thing, and the man who gathered the most of that material is the first to say so. Jacobs has written that when it comes to memory pulled out of a person under hypnosis, it is difficult to imagine a weaker form of evidence. A weaker form of evidence. The researcher with the largest collection telling you the collection is thin. I am not telling you those sessions recovered anything real. I am telling you how many there were, and how few of them, a handful, out of 1,200, describe the one thing this whole account turns on. Someone on the table who fought, and, for a moment, won. So where does a number like that come from? It comes from an archive most people have never opened. The files Bud Hopkins built at the Intruders Foundation. Jacobs' own regression transcripts. Thomas Bullard, a folklorist who did something different, he laid hundreds of accounts side by side and compared their structure, rather than betting everything on one spectacular witness. Raymond Fowler's Case, Investigations. And a 1992 volume called Unusual Personal Experiences, which drew on survey data and carried contributions from Hopkins, Jacobs, and the Harvard psychiatrist John Mack. I have spent the better part of 3 years with this material, and the better part of 2 on this one question, and I want to say something before I use a word of it. I have been a skeptic about regression hypnosis the entire time. The deeper I went, the more it all came back to one method. A therapist, a relaxed subject, and a memory that was not there before the session and is there after. That is the weakness at the center of the field. It is why, for this, I lean hardest on the few accounts that do not depend on it. The case I keep coming back to is not the one you would expect. November 5th, 1975, northeastern Arizona, up near the Mogollon Rim. A 7-man logging crew is driving out of the woods at dusk when they see a light, and then a craft, hanging over a clearing. One of them, Travis Walton, gets out of the truck and walks toward it. The others watch a beam knock him off his feet, and then they panic and drive. When they come back, he is gone. 6 men reported that, and they reported it that night. Walton reappeared 5 days later. And this is where the account becomes his alone, so I want to mark that clearly. Not a dream, not a reconstruction pulled out of him a decade later under hypnosis. An account he gave awake and fast, within days. There is also a serious hoax argument around Walton, and I will come back to it. I am not setting it aside. He says he woke on a table, in a room, with 3 small beings around him, and he says he did something almost nobody in these accounts does. He fought. He swung at them, got to his feet, grabbed a light tube or rod off a shelf, and threatened them with it, and they left. In his words, they abruptly turned and scurried from the room. Scurried from the room. Not advanced, not retaliated, left. Then, he says, human-looking figures appeared. When he resisted being put back on the table, one of them fitted a soft mask over his mouth and nose, and he rapidly lost strength, and then consciousness. A different method entirely. Here is the detail that made me lean forward, and it is not the beam. Walton woke in a room he remembers as too warm, still wearing his work jacket, bunched up under his arms, and what stayed with him was being puzzled that nobody had taken it off him. Fabricators smooth things out. They give you the beam and the operating table. They do not give you a man annoyed about his jacket. I am not telling you a craft took Travis Walton into the Arizona sky. I am telling you what he says happened when he stopped cooperating. The small ones did not overpower him. They withdrew, and something plainer finished the job. Hold on to that. 18 years before Walton, and a hemisphere away, a farmer described the same failure. October 16th, 1957, near São Francisco de Sales, in Minas Gerais, Brazil, a young farmer named Antônio Villas-Boas said that the occupants of a landed craft came for him, and that when he tried to run, they did not freeze him with a look or a wave of force. They grabbed him, several of them, with their hands, and they carried him aboard, a man who fought the whole way and was simply out-muscled. His account was documented by a physician and investigator, Olavo Fontes, working alongside a journalist. There is no second witness to any of it, and I want that on the record too. I want to be careful about what I am and am not saying. The beings Villas-Boas described are not the Greys of the later canon. The morphology is wrong. What matters is the mechanism resistance met not with power, but with hands. And the timing matters more than the morphology, because this is 1957. It predates Betty and Barney Hill. It predates the template. Every later abductee is accused of copying. Now set beside it a second, much quieter account. A forestry worker in Oregon, 1966. I'll call him T.W., because the man who recorded him kept his name private. He described sitting up on the table when he was not meant to be able to, and watching the figures around him move away from him. In his words, I sat up maybe 6 inches. They stepped back. They stepped back. 2 men who had never met. 2 records that, at the time, had never touched. Not the same country. Not the same decade. Not the same language. The same collapse. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and every time it repeats, the answer to a body that will not obey is a physical one. Now, here is where the skeptic in me raises a hand and does not lower it. There is an ordinary explanation for a great deal of this, and it is a good one. Richard McNally, a psychologist at Harvard, has shown how closely some abduction reports track the experience of sleep paralysis, waking unable to move, sensing a presence, seeing an intruder who is not there. Susan Clancy found that people reporting recovered abduction memories were markedly more prone to false recall, with no matching gain in accurate memory. And Nicholas Spanos argued that hypnosis and a leading interview can hand a person the very expectations that come back later as memory. I take that critique seriously. I am not going to pretend it has been answered. Against the hypnosis-recovered cases, it is close to decisive. But it is weaker against the accounts I have been describing, the ones where a conscious person, in the moment, in front of witnesses, resisted. Walton, Villas-Boas, Charles Hickson at Pascagoula. And those accounts have their own problems, which I am not hiding Walton's hoax literature, a Central Australian case file that was never released. This raises a simple but critical question. If the sleep paralysis explanation cannot reach the conscious cases, and the conscious cases cannot be verified, then what is left is narrower than proof. It is recurrence. So let me lay the accounts out the way they actually fall. There are, when you separate them by what happens after a subject becomes aware or resists, 5 distinct responses. I want to be precise about this. I am not inventing these categories. I'm observing them the way you would notice that a stack of very different stories keeps ending in the same 5 ways. Response 1. Motor lock. The most common and the least mysterious sounding until you sit with it. Charles Hickson at Pascagoula, Mississippi, on the 11th of October, 1973, described being taken by something and going numb, not unconscious, numb, paralyzed, and awake for all of it, while his companion Calvin Parker passed out entirely. In the Allagash case in Maine, the investigator Raymond Fowler wrote that the beings held the men in a state that simply did not permit resistance. And a woman I will call Sandra, a night shift respiratory therapist, not her real name, described the lock coming off before anything else did. My hand came loose first, she said. Then the fear hit. Then the fear hit. Like somebody turned the volume all the way up. That combination awake and switched off and aware of both at once is the thing nearly every one of these accounts starts from. The body returns, and something arrives to replace the control that just failed. Response 2. Gaze capture. Here the eyes are not a feature. They are the instrument. Barney Hill, in 1961, under hypnosis years afterward, kept returning to the eyes. "Oh, those eyes," he said, "they're in my brain. They're in my brain." At Buff Ledge, in Vermont, in 1968, 2 young camp workers separately described small gray figures and a wordless contact that came through the eyes. And a machine shop supervisor from the Phoenix area, identified only as RM, put it in the flattest possible terms. "I could move until it looked at me," he said. "Then my body got taken off the circuit." Off the circuit. Attention itself, used as a switch. Response 3. Affective flooding. And here I have to slow down because this is where the record gets thin and the temptation gets strong. Kelly Cahill in Victoria, Australia in 1993 described tall dark figures, and I want to be exact, not grays, and this is not a gray case, along with words that arrived inside her head and a wave of fear and force that put her down. She reported the impression of a phrase, "Let's kill them, let's kill them." That is real, in the sense that she reported it. What is not established anywhere in the verifiable record is the next step, the idea of fear as a deliberate weapon, aimed and fired. That claim I can only give you through a witness I cannot check, a school secretary in the English Midlands, 1977, whom I will call Patricia. She said the fear did not build. It replaced everything. There wasn't room for anything else. Room for anything else. Not the muscles this time, not the eyes, the fear itself. Response 4. Pain and its opposite. Betty Hill described real pain during the examination, a needle, a procedure, and then something stranger. An entity made a gesture near her eyes, and the pain simply stopped. Modulation, in both directions. That is in the documented account, and I will not stretch it further than it goes. The stronger claim pain placed in one exact spot to force compliance again rides on a witness I cannot verify. A pathology technician in Brisbane, 1998, whom I will call Maria T., described it not as being hurt all over, but as something finding a single point, like somebody had found the wire for my shoulder. Found the wire. A control system, not an act of cruelty. I should tell you where those last voices come from, because it matters. Sandra and the Oregon logger were recorded by a private interviewer on a set of cassettes that, after his death, passed to a collector nobody has been able to name. I have not heard them. I am working from transcription. That is exactly as weak as it sounds, and I am telling you so rather than dressing it up. Response 5. Withdrawal and the fallback. This is the strangest, and it is the reason for everything I have said so far. Go back to Walton. He fought, and the small beings did not escalate. They halted, and then they left, and something else, something with hands and a mask, finished what their control could not. Not a stronger current into the mind, not a bigger wave of whatever had held him, a physical restraint, applied by figures that looked like us. 4 of these 5 responses are the machine working. The 5th is the machine failing and being quietly replaced by a cruder one. Look at the order. Motor, then attention, then emotion, then sensation, then retreat. Each one reaches for a different part of a person, the muscles, the gaze, the feelings, the nerves, and finally nothing internal at all, just distance and a mask. You cannot swap any 2 of them without the sequence falling apart. I don't know why they retreated in that last category. I genuinely don't, but I know it is not what the story is supposed to do. If any of this were a machine, it would leave a mark. So follow the marks. Walton's crew corroborated the light and the disappearance, but the beam that supposedly knocked him flat left none of the burns, none of the injuries you would expect, and that absence is one of the strongest points the skeptics have. It also feeds the hoax argument I promised to come back to. A logging contract behind schedule, a payout for the story, and a body without a scratch on it. I cannot make that go away, and I will not pretend to. Betty and Barney Hill came home with a torn dress and scuffed shoes. Real objects. They established that something happened on a road that night. They established nothing about what. Kelly Cahill reported a triangular mark and abdominal symptoms afterward, and investigators claimed other witnesses carried marks too. Here's the strangest part. The organization that investigated it, Phenomena Research Australia, reportedly assembled a document that ran to something like 300 pages, and it was never released. The medical material sat behind it, withheld. The single largest file on the case is the one nobody outside can read. In Sydney, in 1992, a man named Peter Curry said he kept physical evidence hairs from an encounter, and the researcher Bill Chalker later described DNA testing on them, with results he called unusual. But there is no independent replication anyone can point to, and no clean chain of custody. The analysis exists. The verification stops. I am not saying the marks are nothing. I am saying I could not follow a single one of them to the end. Every trail is good for exactly one thing: atmosphere and absence. None of it is proof. The contamination argument has to answer for two things it does not like: timing and geography. Timing first. If these accounts are just a story the culture taught itself, the story has to come before the accounts. But Villas-Boas is 1957, and the Hills are 1961, and both predate the saturation, the films, the documentaries, the paperback on every drugstore rack. Some of this testimony exists before there was a script to copy. Then geography. Lay the cases on a map. Brazil, the United States, the Hills, Buff Ledge, Pascagoula, Walton, Allagash, England, at Avley, Poland, where a farmer named Jan Wolski described short beings, and an examination conducted almost politely, by gesture and notably without the telepathic paralysis that supposedly defines the phenomenon. That case matters precisely because it does not fit. It keeps me honest. Australia, with Cahill and Curry, and Zimbabwe. In 1994, at the Ariel School in Rua, dozens of children described small beings and, some of them, a message received without words. It was documented first by Cynthia Hind and later by John Mack. I have to flag something there, though. The wordless message element grew more prominent in the later interviews than it was in the earliest ones, which is exactly the kind of drift the skeptics warn about, and I am not going to pretend it away. Raymond Fowler, writing about Allagash, said the men simply could not resist their demands, could not resist. That phrasing recurs across decades and languages in people who could not have coordinated it. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But here is the honesty the case requires. What actually recurs is a narrow bundle: immobility, examination, wordless communication, a gap in memory, not psychosis, not contamination, not a script borrowed from a film. That bundle is real. The other bundle, resistance, then a wave of fear, then targeted pain, does not recur across cultures in the verifiable record. It sits on the witnesses I cannot check. I want that line drawn clearly, because the moment I blur it, I have stopped reporting and started selling. And the institutions? They were not hiding this. They were not looking at it. When John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist, published Abduction in 1994, his university convened a formal review of how he had conducted the work. It is a real episode of institutional pressure, and it is worth being accurate about how it ended. Harvard reaffirmed his academic freedom. He remained a faculty member in good standing, and he was cautioned about clinical standards. Not fired, not silenced, warned. The government record is thinner than the mythology wants it to be. Project Blue Book closed on the 17th of December, 1969. It had logged 12,618 sightings. 701 of them were left unidentified. 701, and the Air Force still reported no evidence of vehicles or technology from anywhere but here. The Condon report, the year before, had already concluded that more study was unlikely to teach anyone anything. Britain ran its own quiet assessment, Project Conding, from 1996 to 2000, later released under the Freedom of Information Act, and it landed on rare atmospheric plasma, lights in the sky, not tables, not masks, and here is what none of them ever did. Not one program on record ever asked whether an abductor can induce paralysis or fear or pain. That analysis was never classified. It was never written. The silence was deafening, and I want to resist the easy reading of it. The question I keep returning to is not whether this was suppressed. I am genuinely uncertain about that. It is whether it is something simpler and stranger, a bureaucracy meeting a category of event it has no box for, and choosing, at every turn, the path that requires the least paperwork. So let me set the pieces down in a different order. The whole genre rests on an assumption we never quite say out loud, that when a human breaks free, the answer is more power, a stronger wave, a harder push into the mind. That is the story the premise wants beings whose dominance is total, escalating until the resistance drowns. The one real account clear enough to test that assumption shows the opposite. Walton refused and swung, and the beings who had held his whole body did not push harder. They halted, and that's where it becomes impossible to ignore, because whatever restored control was not psychic at all. It was a mask and a pair of hands, and it belonged to figures that looked human. Apparent superiority did not equal physical dominance. I have to be honest about the size of this. It is one account, one unusually clear, unusually early, still disputed account, not a proven rule about a species. The strong version, that they always answer resistance with a neurological weapon, is exactly the thing the record does not support. But read it plainly, at face value, and the reframe is this: everything we are told about these beings says their power is the mind. And in the one account clear enough to test it, the first thing that power did when a man refused it was step back. Not overwhelming force, not a stronger wave, not a show of power, retreat. I don't know what that means. It may mean nothing, but I cannot make it mean strength. I want to go back to Travis Walton for a moment, and not to the ship. Set aside the beam and the table and the 5 days. What I keep returning to is smaller than any of it, and it is the thing he himself seems never to have settled. He was a young logger. He was frightened and hurt and outnumbered, and cornered in a room he did not understand. And when he stood up and swung a light plastic rod at 3 small figures, they moved away from him. They halted. I've read his account of that one moment more times than I can defend, 40 times, 50. And the question that stays is not what they were, or where they took him. It is why he, a scared man with a piece of plastic, was something they chose to back away from. That is not a question about technology. It is a question about a person standing up in that room and finding that the things in control of everything had, for one moment, less nerve than he did. He wondered about that for the rest of his life, not the physiology, not the craft, but that one small thing, and I still don't know what to do with it. Let me try to synthesize, not to conclude. 5 responses: when control fails, motor lock, gaze capture, affective flooding, pain and its modulation, and withdrawal. The first 4 are the reported machine doing its work on a body. The 5th is the machine failing, and a plainer method taking over. I keep returning to the same place, which is the line between what the record holds and what it does not. It holds the template immobility, examination, wordless contact, the missing time. That much recurs where copying cannot explain it. It does not hold the escalation, the aimed fear, the placed pain. That lives entirely on witnesses no one can check, on cassettes in a collection no one can name. So I cannot tell you these beings have a fear weapon. I cannot tell you what sits under the pattern at all. I have gone looking for the case that would settle it, a documented gray, inflicting a measured pain on a subject who broke free in front of someone who could verify it, and it is not there. What survives, when you strip out everything unverifiable, is not proof of a technology. It is something quieter and harder to dismiss, a recurring shape in how these accounts end, not with a display of power, with a retreat and a mask, and a person left wondering why. So here is what I am left with. Not answers. I want to be clear about that after 3 years. I do not have answers. What I have is a short list of questions, the ones that did not go away no matter how long I sat with the files, and I am going to read them out rather than resolve them. What breaks first when a person comes back, the body or the fear? If the control is total, why does it ever have to be reasserted at all? Why is the clearest resistance we have answered not with force, but with a mask? What steps back when they step back? Is a fear that arrives on cue the same thing as a fear that is sent? Why does the pain, in the accounts that have it, seem to know exactly where to go? Why did the institutions, with all their files and all their funding, never once ask the question? If nothing real is happening here, why does the same shape surface in a Brazilian field, on an Australian road, in a Zimbabwean schoolyard, where no one could have copied anyone? And if something real is happening, why does it retreat? What is a technology that can hold a mind and cannot hold a body? And what, in that room, after the power failed, what finished the job? I have spent 3 years with this, and I am going to leave it where it actually ends, not where I would like it to. They halted. And then, in the account that goes furthest, something plainer than power finished what the power could not. Not a weapon of fear, not a wave, a mask and a pair of ordinary hands, in a room no one can find, described by a man who could never say why the things that ruled his body flinched from his. Everything we are told about them says they did not need to step back. In the one account clear enough to test, they stepped back anyway. The file does not say what finished it, it just stops.